Good morning, Mr. Stephen Sherman. Would you like to say something to introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Steve Sherman. I served in Vietnam with 5th Special Forces Group in 1967 and 68. 69 to 71, I was back again in Vietnam as a civilian. Long after the war, starting about 1990, I reproduced the magazines. Did a lot of work with Special Forces history, reproduced the magazines that we had in Vietnam, as you can see here. And in the more recent years, after about the year 2000, I started getting involved in the overall history of the Vietnam War, or the Second Indochina War, as some of my friends like to call it. And we began to do a series of books on it, on the overall history. And that's what led me to the conference in Austin.
The Republic of Vietnam Army played a major role during the Vietnam War, but from the American perspective, the South Vietnamese troops were coward, incompetent, had no place in history of the war. What do you say about that? Do you think the American media treats South Vietnam soldiers unfair?
The Vietnam War is different from time to time, place to place, and unit by unit. Before 1963, I think that the Army had little opposition, and they were somewhat arrogant. And afterward, 64, they began to break up a little bit, and they were, by 65, they were well underarmed. The North Vietnamese had AKs, and the South Vietnamese were still armed with carbines. From 1970, or after the Tet Offensive, they began to get M16s, and they became vastly improved. The difference between the South Vietnamese and the Americans is that the South Vietnamese were in the war for the duration. The communists seemed to be very steadfast fighters, but the fact is that if they weren't, the punishment for that would have been very terrible. The South Vietnamese Army didn't operate under such stringent conditions.
Recently, in Tom Hayden's remark at the Vietnam War Summit, he said, quote, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese troops were paid for, trained, and sent to their death under our command, but their honor had never been recognized. The both people are honored, but not the Saigon troops who sacrificed for us. End quote. Do you think Hayden's perception is right or wrong?
Bill Laurie and I did a presentation on ARVN at the Texas Tech seminars. It's still on their website. I liked your response to Hayden. And the original Vietnamese coming to the U.S. were self-reliant. They've been superseded by new arrivals and by Western-educated second-generation children who've lost the values of their parents and grandparents.
Did you have any opportunity to approach and fight alongside South Vietnamese soldiers to witness their courage and ability in combat? If so, can you tell us some example?
I was primarily a staff officer, but I had many friends whose lives depended on the Vietnamese and the Montagnards with whom they fought. The Mike forces were one of the best light infantry units in history. The 81st ARVN Rangers supporting Delta were superb. The recon teams were doing things that nobody has done since or before. And the Border Ranger battalions surprised me as I learned after the war about how well they fought in some very bad conditions without the support that they had as the IGG camps. One of the units even managed to wander all through 2 Corps and 3 Corps, showing up in Swan Lock in the final days and gaining themselves a reputation for ferocity at that battle in 1975.
Do you think Dr. Kissinger had no knowledge or experience to deal with the Vietnamese communists, or he just betrayed our people in order to achieve the so-called peace with honors, regardless of the high price millions of South Vietnamese people have to pay right after the fall of Saigon?
Kissinger is a very complex character, and you have to study him very, very closely to understand exactly what happened. Coming from Vietnam, I have every sympathy with your blaming the U.S. as a whole for what happened. But now, as U.S. citizens, you should be understanding the saying, talking about Afghanistan and Iraq, saying the Americans are abandoning Iraq or Afghanistan the way they did Vietnam, I have to laugh, chuckle to myself, because those commentators are Americans now. They are no longer Vietnamese. And the real culprit in the Vietnam War was not the agreement that Kissinger made, but it was the way Congress cut off the enforcement of that agreement. They cut off the funds for South Vietnam, cut back the funds for South Vietnam, and South Vietnam was not able to compete with the Soviet-supplied arms that the North Vietnamese had. And the Democratic Congress of 1972, 73, also cut off the use of the U.S. air power, which would have been necessary to enforce the agreement and would have been instrumental in any kind of actions in 1975 that we could have taken.
Mr. Sherman, and now the last question. As soon as they won the war, the communists destroyed all the barren side of our oven. That included the famous military cemetery at Bien Hoa. Year after year, this cemetery was heavily damaged, and Vietnam doesn't officially allow people to repair it. What do you say about this?
What can I say about it? The communists are not